the Red Sox off to a strong start for this season. We continue our series Around the Horn, baseball history in the region. With us tonight, Brian W. Turner, co-author of the Hurrah Game, which focuses on the history of baseball in Northampton and a lot more.
The Round Hill very forward-thinking dedication to physical education as part of the curriculum. And we knew some kind of ball game had been played there because when reunions were held many years later, many of the players were now very prosperous and quite well-known men like John Murray Forbes, the railroad magnate, and George Shattuck, a doctor in Boston, who also founded St. Paul's School up in New Hampshire on the same model as the Round Hill School. And they both said they played baseball at the Round Hill School. But we had to be careful because in all likelihood, that was not the name used. Maybe a variety of names were used, and that probably turned out to be the case. And furthermore, we can't be sure what variations of baseball were played. So we tried to figure out what kind of games were played there, and through a series of poking into this and poking into that, the answer came to us in part through a translation of a German gymnastics text done by the gym teacher named Dr. Beck, Dr. Carl Beck, who later went on to work at Harvard. And he translated because the Round Hill School was the first school in the United States to introduce gymnastics, Beck went on to translate his mentor's book about gymnastics, and in it, it referred, the original, to the German ball game. And the rules of the German ball game had been published back in the 1790s by a scholar in Germany. And he changed that to just ball play for the American readers. And he even said very specifically, we approve of this game. It involves running, throwing, hitting. And the name by which it is known is not important because there are so many variations. So he stymied us a little bit there. A little bit. And some of those variations could have been round ball, batten ball, goal ball is another name for baseball-like games. And they could have come from anywhere in then the Union, because the Round Hill took students from a national clientele from the South, the North, and even the West. They took students from Canada and Mexico. So it was a very international and fully national school. Then a graduate of the Round Hill School, John Murray Forbes, became a trader in China, in Canton. And in 1839, only 9 years after he graduated from the Round Hill School, he formed a baseball club. He just referred to it as ball playing in his letters home to his wife. But it was very clear by his descriptions that he was playing by what we call the Massachusetts rules, foremost of which involves, as you're running around the bases, you can put a runner out by hitting him with a baseball thrown. Then the New York rules, which developed later and are now the basis for baseball as we know it, they don't do that. And he even said in his letters how much this reminds me of when we played ball at school. So that's when we knew precisely what kind of game they were playing there.
For me, one of the big finds, if you will, in the Hurrah Game was the history you found that the integration of adult baseball, organized team baseball, appears to have happened in Northampton in the mid-1860s.
Yes.
So we're talking 80 plus years before Jackie Robinson, Brooklyn Dodgers. Tell us about that.
Well, it's very interesting. The earliest known instance previously was in 1869, and that was in Oberlin, Ohio. And specifically, the part of Northampton where this occurred was the Florence section. Now, Florence in Northampton was the industrial area, and it was also an area which had a utopian transcendentalist community called the Northampton Association. And that was the only of those associations, along with Brook Farm, Fruitvale, that were formed in the early 1840s that allowed black people to be members. So Sojourner Truth, David Ruggles, and there were two other black members. Stephen Washington, I think was the name of one, I can't remember the other. When the utopian community failed, Florence became a place where blacks were well integrated with whites. Sojourner Truth continued to live there, and so did David Ruggles. There were also free blacks who were attracted to that area, and one of them was Luther B. Askin's family, who came from Pittsfield. And Luther B. Askin, therefore, grew up with all these people who had been taught to treat blacks as equals, as people you freely associated with. This is not the norm throughout most of America at that time. The result is that when the time came, I mean, when Luther was young, he was playing ball with the white kids. When the time came to form an adult club in 1865, Luther said, I wanted to play. Who was going to object? And so that was the first earliest instance. However, it was a very quiet instance. The one in Oberlin was well publicized. And the reason it was well publicized is because a rule was passed in 1867 by the National Association that black clubs could not join them, and that black players could not play on white teams. So it's 1867, 2 years after the Civil War, a rule is passed segregating baseball. Once that rule was in place, anybody who put a black player on their team could be accused of breaking the rule. So the fact that Oberlin, Ohio did that was very, very telling, and it was a public fact. Luther B. Askin was very light-skinned. Everyone in Florence knew that his family was black, because some members were blacker than others. But when the Florence Eagles went to play Springfield or other teams, people may not have known he was black. Now, what happened as a result is he suddenly left the team. We don't know if race was the cause of it or something else. But he left in 1866 after the Florence team suffered its first loss in an attempt to win the championship silver ball from the Hamden Chickapees, just down the road. They were the current champions. They lost that one. Later that season, they won. Florence won the silver ball for a while. Luther had a bad day that day. They demoted him, and a white man took his place. 50 years later, Luther appears at the reunions of the championship and the founding of the team, and he speaks about the history of baseball to everyone present. We know he's there from the newspaper records. But when the photos were taken of the team members, he was not included in the photo. So the thinking was, what's going on here? Why isn't he being acknowledged visually? Well, it took some sleuthing, but we figured out that his namesake and oldest son, Luther B. Askin Jr., was passing for white in upstate New York. He became a renowned band leader and a teacher of music in a school in New York. And so at the precise time Luther would have to stand up and say, here I am, a black man who played baseball in the 1860s, he didn't want to. That's my best guess. And when we contacted the family, it became clear that the descendants didn't even know that Luther Jr. had come from a black family, which made it a very tricky subject. So it remained a secret until 1990s, when my next door neighbor was 100 at the time, named Jim Ryan, who used to be a ball player in the 1920s, said he had met one of the Eagles. I said, oh, fascinating. In the 1920s, he had met them when the Eagle player, he said, was in his 80s. That was Luther. And he said, yeah, black guy. And I'm like, what? Why doesn't anyone know about this? He said, oh, everybody in town knows. And so somebody in 1990, who's 100, recalled talking and meeting an 80-year-old in the 1920s who had played ball in the 1865 and 66. And suddenly it seemed like everything came so close together. The entire history seemed like it was a matter of a few days.
We barely in our time here scratched the surface of what you do in the book and what your research has been, but bottom line, baseball has a rich, very long history in our region.
Very much so.
Well, thank you very much, sir, for your time. Appreciate having you with us.